Okay, good morning, everyone. Or to some of you, good morning again. Um, good morning, Casey. Casey's here. Good morning. Good morning, Lily. Cindy's here. Good morning, Cindy. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Ying. Good morning, Thika again. Good morning, Karen again. Faye, good morning. I like the cute little dog in your avatar there, Faye. He's really cute. Morning, Sabrina. Who else? Who else is here? Michael's here. Good morning, Michael. Who else? Who else? Who else? I think I gave you a little bit too long to read that section. I think I overestimated a little bit. So I'm sorry about that. I'll try not to give you too much time in the future, but I think that was maybe a little much. But that's okay. That's okay for today. Adalbert's here. Good morning, Adalbert. Good morning, Jenna. Good morning, Lim. Nice to see you, quote unquote. Morning, Min. How are you? Okay, so people are sort of showing up and trickling in. Today, what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit more about religion. We'll talk about what we just read in the textbook and the questions that we have answers to, and we will talk a little bit about an assignment I have for you as well. Okay, Eliana, good morning. Before I forget, I will just state that I think we should do our second oral quiz on Monday. I think it should be from classes 10 to 16. The first quiz I think was classes 2 to 8. And so this one will be classes 10 to 16. Same thing as, we'll do the same thing as we did last time. I'll just open a meeting in Microsoft Teams and you guys can just sort of jump in and out really quickly, which will be good. I'll be able to kind of see your face and talk to you one-on-one, which will be great, because we kind of aren't able to do that in this sort of way. Pearly, good morning. Good morning to you. So that's what we'll do. So quiz on Monday, but for now, let's dive into what we were talking about. Good morning or good evening, Ella. When is it? If it is the quiz, I will say that it is on Monday during this class period. Monday during this class period on the material from classes 10 to 16. Good morning, Jimmy. Okay, let's dive in and do this thing, okay? Here we go. So yesterday, if you recall, we were talking about a little bit about Egyptian religion, but also about religion in general. Religion is kind of one of the things that the Egyptians are known for, in part because of all of the artwork and tombs they've left behind, in part because we have sort of preserved mummies, we have preserved bodies from the Egyptians because they did such a good job preserving them, but also of course because the Egyptians were a profoundly religious civilization, and we've talked about that a little bit in that really everything that the Egyptians did had a religious connection or a religious connotation for them. But before we kind of got into that, we talked about what religions were for in general, okay? And we said this because as an anthropologist, religions are an important part of culture. They help cultures to function in various ways. They do things to help people to bond together and to cooperate and to understand the world around them. And religion or spirituality in some way is a cultural universal. And so as far as we know, all cultures in all times have had some sort of spiritual or religious practice. All of them have had some kind of imagining or conception of supernatural powers or powers that are in control of the world and the universe. And so all people have tried to explain the same things. They've all tried to explain what the universe is and how it works and where the earth came from and where we come from and why we're here and what happens when we're not here, what happens when we die. All cultures have some kind of spiritual practice that attempts to do those things, and of course the details are different, but every culture has those things. And so we said that religions are these things, and actually maybe we'll just jump to the 5 characteristics that we talked about. One of the characteristics we said was that all religions assume that there is some sort of supernatural power. And again, we said, Luan, good morning. Carmen, good morning. Again, we said that sometimes people believe in a single god. Sometimes they believe in multiple gods. Sometimes they believe that things have a spirit. And so not just people or not just animals, but sometimes plants and rocks and lakes and things like that. Sometimes people believe in some kind of energy force. There's all kinds of different ways of thinking about supernatural power. But all religions assume that there is one, that there is some kind of greater power at work in the universe. And of course, all religions believe that, or all religions have someone in the community who knows how to interact with these powers. And so sometimes they're priests, sometimes they're shamans, sometimes they're imams or gurus or rabbis or any kind of spiritual leader is this, someone who can interact with supernatural powers and sort of work as a go-between between humans and those powers. We said that all cultures rationalize their religious systems through the use of myths and storytelling. Okay, so the myths that a culture uses to entertain itself and to help it understand the world and help it to communicate its values and beliefs to the next generation, those myths also help to support the worldview and the religion of the people of that society. So again, we talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh isn't necessarily a religious story, but it supports the religious worldview of the Sumerians. It talks about the Sumerian gods, and it shows what happens when you disrespect the gods. And so the religious world, the religion of the Sumerians, is supported by the Epic of Gilgamesh, even though Gilgamesh isn't really a religious story. And so all cultures have this. All cultures have stories that help to legitimize and support the religion, whatever the religion is. We said that religions serve to reduce anxiety by providing an explanation for the unknown. So again, there are things that humans find it difficult to explain. Even today, we find it difficult to know what happens after we die. Does our consciousness or spirit or soul go somewhere else, or does it not? Is reincarnation what happens? Nobody really knows. And so religions seek to calm people and give them a comforting explanation of things that they don't understand. And in ancient times, of course, there were all kinds of things that people didn't understand, and religion was in many cases, religion took the place of science in that it gave people an explanation for the way that the world worked. And in addition to that, it teaches morality to the people in the society as well. Lots of our religions have within them not only an explanation of how the world works and how we came to be, but also how we can be a good person, what things we should do and shouldn't do, right? We said that religion was a convenient way of transferring the burden of decision-making from individuals to supernatural powers. And so, again, if you're a king or a pharaoh or a leader of a civilization, it's much easier to make a decision when the god has told you to do it, right? Because then if you make the wrong decision, it's the god's fault, it's not yours, right? And hopefully your people won't be angry with you. Interestingly, as you probably read today, that becomes a bit of a problem for the pharaohs, right? Because the pharaohs actually are gods. And so when things start to, when things don't go so well in Egypt, pharaohs kind of lose their power. People stop listening to them because they don't have anyone to sort of pass the responsibility on to, because the responsibility ends there. They are the god. And finally, we said that religion serves as a mechanism of social control. And so it helps to establish social behaviors, and it establishes punishments for people who break the rules. And so again, social control is important, right? We don't want to live in a society where people run around and just do whatever they want, right? We don't want people stealing and murdering and doing all sorts of awful things. Nobody can live with that. And so if we're going to live with other human beings, we need rules for behavior. And so religions help us to establish those rules, and they try to keep people in line with punishments, right? And so those punishments can be all kinds of things, from kind of a karma type idea where if you do bad things will happen to you. It could have to do with your reincarnation. It could have to do with your ability to enter paradise or heaven or the afterlife, right? If you don't follow the rules, some form of punishment will occur, right? And so that helps people live together in sort of a cooperative society if they have similar rules for how they should behave, okay? And religion helps do that. So like we talked about the other day, or like we've mentioned a few times, Egyptian religion is polytheistic, and so they have multiple gods that are connected to forces of nature or aspects of human life. And like we often see, they are human-like gods, so they're anthropomorphic, they're in the shape of humans, but many of them have animal heads. And so there's kind of a fusion between the human world and the natural world and the world of the gods. So I introduced you to a few important gods yesterday, and we saw a little video on them. So there's Osiris, who starts out as kind of he starts out as a king of Egypt. He starts out as someone who teaches people how to live and how to grow grain and things like that. So he's a bit of an agricultural and harvest god as well. But then this story later appears about him being killed by his brother Set. And so he kind of becomes a king of the underworld, but is still associated with agricultural harvest and fertility nonetheless. And so he's kind of a major god in Egypt, kind of a father figure, if you will. And again, starts out as a bit of an agricultural god and sort of evolves into a god of the underworld. We met his sister Isis and his wife Isis. They are kind of a married couple, and again, she's kind of a female protector spirit, a protector of the home, a protector of women. And again, she is very popular in ancient Egypt, and her popularity actually extends beyond Egypt. And so a little bit later in Egyptian history, some of the Greeks start worshiping her, some of the Romans worship her, and there's even some people floating around today that are interested in the worship of Isis. So she's still not gone thousands of years later. Here's our good friend Horus. Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris. He is a god of war, but he's also associated with the sun. He's also associated with the pharaoh. And he's connected to that Osiris story as well, and I'll tell you about that in just a few minutes. And then there's Set, right? And Set is the brother of Osiris and Isis. He's married to his sister Nephthys, and he starts out as a bit of a god of chaos, a god of the desert sort of thing, but eventually he kind of evolves into an embodiment of evil, right? And so in that Osiris story, he betrays his brother, murders him, cuts him up into a bunch of pieces, and steals the throne of Egypt from his brother Osiris. So again, he starts off as a bit of a god of chaos and of the desert, and eventually he kind of turns into a little more of a bad guy. So we watched this video with Mike Rugnetta about Pantheons, and I asked you a few questions and you answered them. And so we said that the purpose of the gods, or why do people imagine divine characters, was in part because they wanted to understand how the world worked and how nature and the universe operated. And of course, without sophisticated science and technology, sometimes they didn't quite understand what was happening, and so the gods helped them to understand that. But it also helped them to deal with the fear of death and mortality, right? We said that it might be scary to know that, you know, you're living this life, and then when you die, that's it. That's the end, right? And so we said that people often create immortal characters. They create people who can never die, because if it's possible for a god to live forever, then maybe somehow we can as well, right? And so if we die, maybe we can enter into another life, or maybe we can enter into a paradise or a heaven or something like that. And so gods help to sort of console people about the fear of death, or the fear that death might be the end. In the video, they introduced us to some characters of the Sumerian pantheon, and we said it was kind of interesting that the Sumerians had a sheep god and a shepherd. And so we said that might be connected to the way that the Sumerians lived their lives before they turned to agriculture, before they started to farming. And maybe they had herds of sheep, and that's how they made their living. Now this one, who was first of the Egyptian gods? That one we didn't answer. So who is it? Who's first among the Egyptian gods? First among the Egyptian gods. Yeah, Ra. Ra is the first one. And so Karen's right, and KC is right too, because Atum and Ra are sort of different names for the same god. And so people in different parts of Egypt use different words for him sometimes. And again, the role of these gods evolves over time. And so sometimes this god is referred to as Ra, sometimes Atum, sometimes Atum Ra. Okay. Cindy says the goddess Ki and the sky god An. I guess the first in terms of who was created. I guess so. Cindy, you're right there in terms of they come first in the story of the Egyptian pantheon, right? They appear first because they will give birth to other gods later. So I guess, yeah, if we think about the question that way, then Cindy, you're definitely right. And Dika, same thing. Okay, so clearly my question was worded in an ambiguous way because people answered it differently. So yeah, so the first deities are Ki and An, so the earth and the sky. So those are very true, but Atum and Atum Ra become sort of the most popular, right? I'm not sure if you meant that for this question or not, Ying, but I'm just gonna leave it for now. So how do we know, based on the video, how did we know that the sun god was seen as the most important to the religion of ancient Egypt? So how do we know that Ra was so important? Okay, so Cindy's got here, the sun represents light to defeat the darkness and also the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, as for providing life and giving energy. Ooh, that's good. That's good. The sun is the opposite of chaos, peace, and rules. Okay. What else do we have here? What else do we have here? Okay, so Liana says day and night is dark, so the sun. Okay. Present in many writings. People need the sun to survive. Yeah, so I think there are some important themes here in your answers, and I'm going to admit at the moment I can't remember exactly what the video said on this topic, but I'm going to do my best here anyway. Based on what you said, there is one of the important things is that we see Ra represented in many paintings and carvings, right? So Ra is always kind of up there. Sometimes you can see Ra, the sort of sun's rays coming down. So Ra is an important god because he shows up so often. A lot of you have said kind of light and warmth and the fact that people need the sun to survive, right? If you, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Egypt. If you have, I'm envious of you. But I think if you live in Egypt, one of the things that is very present in your daily life is the sun, right? It's a warm desert. There's not a lot of clouds. There's barely any rain. And so every day is sunny. And so the sun has a lot to do with how you experience the world. It's always there, kind of beating down on you. And of course, it's critical for the growth of your crops, right? The crops need sunlight in order to grow. And so the sun kind of gives light, it gives life, chases away darkness. It's very present in lots of artwork and paintings and carvings that we see in ancient Egypt. And the pharaoh after the pharaoh died, he was assumed to ascend and he would become Ra. So he would become this sort of god that looked down over everyone. So I think all of those are good. And the other thing that's important about the sun that I'll just throw in here as a bonus is that, you know, the Egyptians had a very strong idea of rebirth, right? And so you would die, your body was mummified, and then you would enter the afterlife and you would live forever. And so there's this kind of cycle of death and rebirth. And so the sun kind of does the same thing, right? The sun dies at night and then it's reborn the next day. And so that was kind of tied into the Egyptians' idea of dying and then sort of being born into paradise. And the sun does the same thing. It dies and then it's reborn the next day. Last one was, how does the story of Osiris explain the need for mummification? And so if you'll remember in the story, Osiris was the king of Egypt and he sort of taught the people how to grow crops and how to live. His brother Set was jealous, put him in a box, threw him in the river, later found him and cut him into a bunch of pieces, murdering him, right? Not cool. Not cool, Set. Cindy says Osiris died, which he did, but again, he comes back to life. Yeah, he rises from the dead. And so, he rises from the dead. Casey says he's pieced back together. Yeah, there's a bunch of different stories about how this happens. And again, in the video, they tell one where Isis cries so loudly that she brings him back to life. There's another version where he's cut up and sort of thrown all over Egypt. There's another version of the story in which he's cut up and thrown all over Egypt, and then Isis collects him back together, and then she has sex with him, and that's how Horus is conceived. So that's a little gross. Actually, the myth is a little more graphic than that, but I won't say what it is. But yeah, in versions of the myth, Osiris is pieced back together, and then and then he comes back to life, right? And they, Isis and I think Nephthys and Anubis, the god with the jackal head, they all kind of work together to bring him back to life. And so he is mummified, right? They wrap him in bandages and they put all these sort of special amulets and charms all over him, and they say all of these kind of prayers and say these ritual things, and that brings him back to life. And so if Osiris can come back to life that way, then other people can as well. Okay, so the myth kind of justifies and explains why the Egyptians mummify their dead, right? Because Osiris did, and that's how they come back to life and enter the next world, right? And again, treatment of the body varies from culture to culture, right? And in many cases, sometimes you need, when you die, in order to enter the next life. With the Egyptians, you had to preserve the body as well as you could. In some cultures and religions, the body needs to be burned, right? You need to reduce it to ash. In some cases, they need to be buried within a certain amount of time. In some cases, they have to be buried with coins in order to sort of have passage into the other world. And so there's all kinds of different funeral rituals that cultures have in order to allow the person to pass from the world of the living into the world of the dead. And of course, the Egyptians have a very famous and a very complicated one. Now, I'm going to answer this question. So, why doesn't Set get into trouble here? Well, he does. The other part of the story that they don't tell in the video is this. So, Osiris is the king. Set is jealous. His kind of strange-headed brother is jealous. He murders Osiris, scatters pieces of him all over Egypt. The story then goes that Isis finds all of these pieces of Osiris, puts him back together, has sex with him, gross, and conceives a son, Horus. But of course, she's concerned that Set will kill Horus as well, because Horus he's the rightful heir to the throne, right? He's the son of the king. And so Isis kind of hides him away. She hides him away until he grows into a man. And then when he's old enough, he comes back and he challenges his uncle Set for the throne of Egypt. And so there's a number of different versions of this story. The one that comes to mind for me off the top of my head is that Set challenges, Horus challenges Set for the throne of Egypt. They fight it out. Horus defeats him and could kill Set, but that would make him just as bad as Set, right, for killing him. So he banishes his uncle to the desert, and then he assumes his rightful place as kind of the king. And for that reason, Horus is associated with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so the Pharaoh is kind of seen kind of as Horus. And then when the Pharaoh dies, he becomes Ra. He sort of becomes the sun god. And so there's kind of this strange interaction. But that's the story of Horus. And so to answer your question, Michael, Set does get punished. He does get defeated by Horus, and then he gets kind of banished. He gets kind of exiled to the desert. Now, does that story sound familiar to you? So the murder of the king maybe by a relative. The murder of the king, the murderer takes the throne, but the son of the king is brought up somewhere else and then later comes back to challenge the king and take his rightful place. Does that sound like any stories you know? Does that one sound familiar? Does that story sound familiar to you? Yeah, yeah, that's the Lion King, right? So yeah, I was going to put that in there. So that's exactly the story of the Lion King, right? Mufasa is killed by his brother Scar. Scar takes the throne, he becomes the king, and Simba is kind of raised away from Scar so Scar won't kill him, and then Simba returns to challenge his uncle, right? And the Lion King is not the only story that's like this, and so it's a very common story in world cultures where the throne is taken from the rightful king by a jealous relative, and then the son of the king is hidden away and then returns later to challenge the king and take back the throne and avenge the death of his father. That's it's a very common theme in stories, and it shows up here in the myth of Horus and Set and Isis and Osiris thousands of years ago. Cool, eh? All right. The next thing I asked you to do was this. I asked you to read a little section of the textbook here and talk about some of the continuities, maybe just in the Old Kingdom at this point. So it's useful to think about these periods of history because they are so long. They are so long, right? If I think of my experience here in Canada, Canada is a baby country, right? We're 150 years old. That's it. We are a very, very young country. Just the Old Kingdom of Egypt lasts about 500 years, right? This is a long, long time. And that's just the first part of Egypt's history, never mind the rest of it. And so even the Old Kingdom period is actually quite long. And again, as the text points out, it's a period of stability, right? Not that much happens. Egypt doesn't get invaded. They don't have any huge environmental or climate issues to deal with. And it's kind of a peaceful period for the country, and it can just go about its business. And so what kind of continuities do we see in the Old Kingdom? How do things stay the same? And Egypt is good for this. Egypt is a country that has very long periods of stability, and there are periods in which some things really remain consistent. Okay, so Cindy says, so the pharaohs had united Upper and Lower Egypt, right? And so in the Old Kingdom, those two stay united, and the pharaoh is king of both. Egypt had a stable population, so their population wasn't growing. They didn't have a need to find more resources all the time, which is good. Their social structure remained the same as well. So the vast majority of people are simple farmers, right? They're growing their crops, they're harvesting, just kind of living their lives, right? And then there's a small group of merchants above them and scribes, maybe a few soldiers, and then priests and the government and the king themselves, right? That all stays consistent. Yeah, the pharaohs became very powerful and wealthy. Yeah, so they had all of Egypt under their control, paying taxes to them, right? Paying grain. And so they could use that grain in order to do things. And many of the things that they did was build. And so Old Kingdom pharaohs and Middle and New Kingdom pharaohs as well were very focused on building things. And so in some cases they were temples, in some cases they were palaces, and in some cases they were tombs for themselves. And of course the pyramids are the most immediate things that come to mind, but a little bit later in the Middle and the New Kingdom, pharaohs stop using pyramids and start using more hidden tombs, but maybe we can talk about that later. So yeah, they become powerful and wealthy. They develop tax collection, which is mostly in the form of grain or the things that people grow. And again, they expand their religious doctrine and they build a state bureaucracy, right? So they're able to have, the Egyptians kind of have this very stable time to develop religiously and to develop politically, right? To develop a very complex political structure and a very complex religion, because again, things are going really well. There's lots of food. Nobody's attacking them from the outside, and it's a very stable period for them, right? Yeah, they have stable numbers of people and social stratification. Yeah, so society remains basically the same. Yeah, social class and religion, that's good. Pika says stable population and good, that's good. And Pearly, tax collection, good. Religious doctrine and state bureaucracy. Yeah, so all of these things are their political lives, their religious lives. They're able to sort of develop and become sort of more complex. At the same time, society is staying rather consistent, right? So their population are stable, their sort of social structure is stable, and part of that has to do with, again, the climate. Because again, the climate of Egypt is very consistent, right? It rains almost never. And so the Egyptians had a very stable environment to live in. Again, nobody was attacking them. But the third thing to maybe remember here is that the stability you might be able to attribute that to religion as well. Because if you think about it, those of you who are religious, or even if you're not, religion is not about change, right? Religion is about consistency. It's about being taught the correct way, and then you do things the correct way, and then you pass that on to the next generation. And so religions are often very resistant to change, okay? And if you think about the Egyptians, where such a huge part of their life was connected to religion, you can see how things remained stable for so long, because everything was religious in their life, everything had a religious significance, and religions don't really like to change that easily. And so, again, the Egyptians had a really long period here in the Old Kingdom, 500 years, in which kind of nothing much happened. They just were able to develop their civilization, they were able to develop their technology, and just kind of live their lives in peace. Yeah, so what was this Egyptian social hierarchy like? I think I unfortunately went and answered that question a little bit, but so Cindy says most people were rural peasant farmers. Yeah, so if you lived in Egypt thousands of years ago, the odds are overwhelming that you are just a simple farmer growing grain. That's your job. That's what most people in ancient Egypt do. Yeah, it was very consistent, of course. There wasn't a lot of change. And I don't think it mentioned in the textbook, but there also wasn't a lot of social mobility either. And so people tended to take on the occupation of their fathers. And so again, if your father was a farmer, that's probably what you were going to be. That's probably what your son was going to be, and his son, and so on. And so people tended to take on the job of their father, and so people didn't tend to move up in society very much. You tended to sort of stay where you were. Yeah, so most people, it was stable or consistent. Most people were rural farmers. Yeah, and those farmers were sometimes required to perform rotating service for the state. And so you could pay your taxes in grain, but you could also pay your taxes with your labor. And so there were certain times of the year as a farmer where you didn't have much work to do, right? After the crop was harvested and processed, there was a period of time where you kind of had nothing to do until you planted your crops again. And so Pharaoh would often say, hey, you guys are all going to come work on this construction project that I have. And so you could pay your taxes through food, but you could also pay it through labor. And so lots of people paid their taxes through labor, like Mashid says. Pearlie says here, the labor of the majority of the population supported more elite and skilled classes, from the pharaoh down through governing bureaucrats, priests and nobles and soldiers and skilled craftspeople. Yeah, so all the people that Pearlie mentions here were higher up in society, but of course, the higher you climbed on the social ladder, the fewer people there were. And so there were lots and lots of rural farmers. There was a good number of merchants, people who sold things, but fewer bureaucrats, fewer priests, and of course fewer higher government officials, and only one pharaoh usually. Yeah, so that's the Egyptian social hierarchy, and I think actually I have a little graphic of it here. I have a little graphic of it here. So let me ask you another question here. So the text talks a little bit about the gender roles and differences between men and women. And so in many agricultural communities, we see that there is inequality between men and women. So men tend to have more power and more rights than women do. And so here in ancient Egypt, we see a bunch of things, right? We see that Egyptian women can actually own property, which is pretty amazing. They can take cases to court, so they have legal rights. And again, married women have some degree of financial independence, and so part of the wealth of the household actually belongs to the married woman. So women have some degree of equality here. Men still have more, right? Men still have more power and more authority and more rights than women, but they're a little bit closer together than you see in some societies. Ying says Egyptian women here could own property, and tax records show that they did. They take their case to court, good, and they can enter into legally binding agreements. So they can sign contracts on their own. They can purchase property on their own. And of course, we can also see them serving as priestesses. So women can be religious authorities. They can be religious leaders. So we've got some general equality like men, but they can own property, take cases to court, serve as priestesses, good. They own properties, they have legal rights, and they're more financially stable. Yeah, and a couple of women actually managed to become pharaohs as well. And so there's one who they mention, I think they mention in the textbook, Hatshepsut. She becomes pharaoh when her son becomes pharaoh, but her son is a child and he's not old enough to be pharaoh, and so she steps in his place and rules Egypt. And so interestingly, she portrays herself as a man, and so she kind of wears the crown of a pharaoh. She kind of wears the fake beard that sometimes you see them wearing, and so she kind of presented herself as a man, but she was actually a woman. Cleopatra is probably the other one that comes immediately to mind, although she's not. She is a woman, but she's not an Egyptian. She's a Greek, and she comes quite a bit later in Egyptian history, but still she's a queen of Egypt. Okay. That's good. And what do I have here? What do we know about what do we know about slavery in Egypt? Because sometimes we hear um, sometimes we hear a lot about slavery in the ancient world, slavery in Egypt. Sometimes we hear stories about how slaves were used to build the pyramid. If you know the biblical story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt, you'll know that in the story, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt, and so um, there's a lot of association with slavery in ancient Egypt. But the question is, what was actually going on? And so uh, Ying says slaves did exist. They labored in the fields, so they were farm workers. They served in the army. They sometimes worked in construction or in commerce, in merchant shops. And they're also domestic servants. And so they could have been butlers or nannies or housekeepers for Egyptians with money and power, right? Yeah, same thing. That's good. Casey says that, and in some cases they were abused by their masters. And so sometimes this is the case, and again, the definition of abuse varies. Sometimes what you see in the ancient world with slaves is that they are mistreated. People who are slaves are seen as property. They're seen as owned by their masters. And so, yeah, some people don't treat them very well. Some people do, however, because if you think about a person as a thing that you own, which is not good, if you think about that, many people take care of the things that they own. And so many people took care of their slaves as well. So it kind of depended on who owned you. But you do see that in the ancient world. Some slaves are horribly mistreated, and some slaves are actually treated quite well because people take care of the things that belong to them. Yeah, if they were free, they were considered part of the general free population. And so to be a slave was more of an economic situation, not a social situation. And so there wasn't really anything wrong with you as a slave. You just happened to be owned by someone else. And so if you were freed, you became a regular part of society. Yeah, most of these people were prisoners of war, and so they were captured in conflict with others. And yeah, they worked in agriculture and military and construction. That's good. And what does Mashid say? Yeah, and they used slaves in the Middle Kingdom. Yeah. And so as time goes on in Egyptian history, slavery becomes more popular. And of course, that's because as time goes on in the Egyptians, they become more involved in military conflicts with people around them. And so the more military conflicts you're involved in, the more slaves you wind up with, right? But early in their history in the Old Kingdom, there's not as many slaves because the Egyptians just aren't involved in warfare with anyone else. And last one, some of the characteristics of the Old Kingdom. We could probably just summarize what we said for this one, but maybe I'll just see what you had. Characteristics of the Old Kingdom. So Cindy says, yeah, the building of the pyramids is a big one. Those 3 pyramids at Giza are very impressive, right? They're a wonder of the ancient world. They're still there today, and they get built during the Old Kingdom, and so they're very much a characteristic of that period, right? There was no standing army, so Egyptians didn't have an organized professional army at this time, and again, they didn't have a lot of conflict with people around them either. So that was nice too. It was a peaceful period, right? It was kind of a quiet period in Egyptian history. Yeah, they built pyramids to emphasize their relationship with the gods. Some people have made the connection, the shape of the pyramids with rays of light. So if you've ever looked up at the sky and you've seen, when it's kind of a cloudy day, but the sun is behind the clouds and you can see the rays of light kind of coming down through the clouds, Some people have made the connection that that's actually what the pyramid is. It's a stone representation of those rays of light coming down from the sun. Yeah, so we have a nice, quiet, stable period of Egyptian history where religion is allowed to flourish, state bureaucracy is allowed to flourish. Most people just kind of go about their daily lives in a fairly consistent way. And again, we see the construction of these massive, massive monumental elements of monumental architecture like the pyramids. Okay, good stuff. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more thing here, and it's a little writing assignment that I would like you to do. Okay, and what I want you to do is, well, I'm going to put it up on the screen here. Okay, just give me 1 second. Give me 1 second to call it up. All right. So I want you to write what I'm calling a micropaper. I don't know if anyone's ever said that before, but that's what I'm calling it. And what it is, it's a very, very short research paper. Okay, so it's basically 1 page long, give or take. If it goes a little off the page, that's okay, but basically it's 1 page long. And it talks about one specific thing and uses one source, okay? And this is kind of what I want you to do. I'll post this for you right after class. I'm just going to put it up on the screen. I'm going to put up on the screen right now. So here is what I would like you to do. That's not right. Pages. This is what I want to show you. Okay. So see how that looks. Okay, good. So I'm saying a micropaper is this. It's a 1-page paper, has a really short introduction, probably a sentence or two. It has a very short conclusion, probably a sentence or two. And it's based on one outside source, okay? And so what I want you to do is write a short paper, write a 1-page paper that summarizes 3 of the characteristics of religion that we just talked about earlier today for one particular world religion. Okay, so this paper will talk about how we see 3 of those characteristics of religion evident in a religion that you choose to research. Okay, now I'm just going to skip over this center section here. I'll let you read that on your own. But this is kind of what you'll do. You'll research a particular world religion. Don't choose the one you belong to. A, that's too easy, and B, I want you to look at this in an anthropological way. And it's difficult to look at your own religion in an anthropological way. So if you're a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim or whatever, don't choose the religion that you belong to, okay? You'll do a little bit of research on it. You'll see how the 5 characteristics are expressed in this religion or how we can see them. I want you to decide the 3 characteristics that you think are most significant, most important. And then I want you to write that using maybe a paragraph or 2, short intro and conclusion. You cite your source at the end, and that's it. And so it might look something, your paper kind of might look something like this. So I've got this little graphic here to kind of help display what this paper might look like. Yeah, so that's what I want you to do. Now, oh, and maybe the last thing we should say too is that I'd like it to be due on the 19th of June. So that'll be not this Friday, but next Friday. So my question then for you, or my questions for you, is does this sound okay? Does this sound doable? Do you have any questions on this right now? Do you understand what I mean? What do you think about that? What's the weight? That is an excellent question, Ella. It is. I'm just checking. It's on the syllabus, but I'm just going to look here since you asked. The weight of each one of them. So we're gonna do 3 of these, Ella, and the 3 of them are worth 35%. So I guess it's worth about 11 or 12% is what this is worth. 11 or 12%. Other questions? Okay, you can ask. I'm going to show you just a couple more things, okay? So again, I will I'll post that assignment sheet in Student Portal and on Microsoft Teams just after we're done so that you can look at it and read through it. Is there a number of words limit? No, but I'd like it to be about 1 page, single space. So I don't want it to be, I don't want you to sort of write pages and pages and pages. The idea is just to write something that's about 1 page, long, okay, which might be difficult, but I have faith in you. Sometimes it's more difficult to write something short than it is to write something long. So I won't count words, but it should be about 1 page long. If it goes a little into the 2nd page, that's okay. I'm not going to be too fussy on that, but it's about 1 page long, okay? Now, the other thing I'll mention is that for your research, for the source that you use to get your information from, there's 2 things you can do, and this I won't go through this in detail because we just did this in social justice, but I could talk about it tomorrow if you want. You can find things in the college website, or you can look online. Now, the college website is much safer because we know that the sources we find there are believable. We know that they are credible. We know that they are the scholarship is done well. So if you go to the Columbia College website here and you click on library, it'll take you here, and then you can click on find materials. And when you do, and then you log in, you'll see a bunch of databases, okay? It'll take you to this page here where all of these different databases are listed. And the ones I would suggest for you for this project are these ones. So you can look at Britannica Online Academic. That's a pretty good one for researching religions. You may find some information on Global Road Warrior, which is also listed. It's also listed here, okay? World Book Online may help you as well. I haven't looked there recently for religious info, but you might find something there. And finally, MAS Ultra has a lot of magazine articles that might be of interest to you. I'm kind of feeling like Britannica Online might be the best one, but you can look and see what you find, okay? So you can research through the college website, which actually for this project I might recommend you to do. I'm going to skip that for now. If you go out on the internet, it's going to be much more difficult, okay? So you're going to need to assess these things. You're going to need to make sure that your information is accurate. And again, I can walk through this with you tomorrow again. You want to make sure that there is an actual author who you can determine and check out and make sure that they're a real person who knows things. Currency is not super important for this project, so it doesn't have to be a very recent source. Fairness, well, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Relevance, we'll talk about that tomorrow too. Yeah, we'll walk through the searching of material in a little more detail tomorrow. But for today, I think I will kind of leave it there and say that, you know, we have a short assignment to do, a short micropaper to do. It's worth about 12%. You'll research a religion and you'll talk about how you see 3 of those 5 characteristics of religion kind of appearing in the religion you've chosen to research. Don't research your own religion. And again, in the end, it'll be about 1 page, single spaced, give or take. Ella, the quiz is next Monday and it's quiz classes 10 to 16. Yes, that is also correct. So on Monday, you'll have to be presentable so I can see your face. So you have to get out of bed and you don't have to do your hair. I'm not judging your appearance, but I need you on camera, so you've got to be comfortable with that. Okay. But yes, Ella, next Monday. Class 10 to 16. The other thing I might do is, since you're asking this question, Ella, I might change the order of people who do the quiz so that people who are overseas like you can actually have the quiz first, and then you can go to bed and you don't have to wait 2 hours for it. I think that might be helpful. So maybe I'll try and organize it that way next time. That's probably a better way to do it. Okay. I think I'll leave it there. Okay, so I'll leave you to think about this assignment. I'm going to post it as soon as we're done here. I'm going to post it on Student Portal, and I'm going to post it on Microsoft Teams so you can look at it. If you have any questions, at any time you can always ask me and I will help you. But for today, I just wanted to sort of very quickly introduce what we needed to do and sort of put it out to you. And then we can talk about it. We can talk about it again tomorrow, and maybe I can give you a little more of a tutorial on how to find things. Yeah, I think I'll do that tomorrow. Okay, so maybe we'll leave it there. We've got about 12 minutes left, but we've been, you know, we didn't have a break halfway through. So I think maybe what we'll do is we'll just leave it there for today. Think about the assignment and think about maybe what religion you might want to do. It could be any religion, past or present. So it could be a current religion that exists, or it could be one that is not practiced anymore. You could use the Egyptian one because we really haven't talked about the characteristics of religion as they relate to Egypt. So you could do Egypt, or you could do any one. As I say, just don't pick your own. Okay, is that all right? Everybody good? Give me a thumbs up if you're good. Okay, so Cindy's good, Sam's good, Dika's good, you're welcome, you're welcome, you're welcome. Pearly's good, Liana's good, Ying is good, Carmen's good, Karen, Casey, both good. Okay, so I'll post that assignment for you to look at. I'll also post a bit of a marking guide for you maybe tomorrow. We'll talk about this assignment again tomorrow, and we'll also try to finish up Egypt, ancient Egypt tomorrow as well, so we can move on. Although I would love to stay and talk about ancient Egypt for longer because I think it's super cool, but we can't do it. So we'll try and wrap it up tomorrow. Okay, so Mashid is good, Dika's good, Jen is good, Adalbert is good. You are very welcome, Miss Sabrina. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Hope everyone has a nice rest of the day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for interacting in the live chat, and I will see you all tomorrow. Okay, so bye. Bye.